Hi. So I've been speaking Latvian for like 20 minutes. I don't know how to speak my own language anymore. So anyways, I'm going to start in a second, but because I know the minute I start talking, more people come in, hopefully. Although half my friends said they're not making it now, so I don't know. So as was stated, so I am currently a docent, or I guess the word is acting assistant professor in the Cultural and Social Anthropology program at University of Latvia, which about 99.9% of you already know. Because you're my students, 99.9% of you in this room. So for those of you who don't know me, please know that while I am a professor and I do have a PhD in anthropology, I also tend to be very informal in my lectures, although this will be the most formal that I've been in a really long time, just based upon what's written in front of me. I'm going to make sure that there's time for questions afterwards so that you can ask as many as you want to if you do feel like asking questions, and I welcome them. I'm already prepared in my head for what people may ask, so I'm hoping you ask what I think you're going to ask, because that will make me really happy. So anyway, so the title of this talk is, well, originally it was Appropriation, Adaptation, Imperial Nostalgia, and the Black African Other, an ethnographic critique of the work of Janeka Simona. I can tell you that the appropriation piece is no longer there for now because it just didn't make it in. It didn't fit. I mean, it fits, but it didn't fit. But the adaptation, the imperial nostalgia, and the Black African Other piece are, as is the work of Janeka Simona, whose work is currently on view at Kim Contemporary Arts Center. Or at least two of his pieces are currently on view at Kim Contemporary Arts Center. But I'm actually going to be talking about 4 of his pieces today, 3 of which you can find if you do some really good Google sleuthing, and 1 of which has yet to appear in the public, has yet to appear online, but has been exhibited. So let's get started and let's see what happens. So Janeka Simona's debut exhibition in 2002 was at the Norwart.pl festival in Krakow. Featured work that was occupied with the uses of technology, not with maps, and the African other. So it was primarily video and computer game manipulation and other technological elements. One example of this was Carpet Invaders, which is, I don't know how many of you know, some of you are so young. If any of you know of the 1980s video game, Space Invaders. So basically what he did was he took Space Invaders and transferred it to a carpet, and some say it's supposed to be a critique of Orientalism and so on. I'm not quite sure. But it was interactive, so you can see that there's like a little hanging down joystick, so you can actually play. You could actually stand and play the game. So this is what he started out doing, because he was a video DJ before he became an artist. And actually, this kind of work in 2002 is kind of very reminiscent of the work of Corey Archangel, who also did similar types of artistic work. So Simon actually doesn't have a background in art. He does not have a degree in art. His bachelor's degree is actually in sociology and psychology from Malinowski's, who's the father of ethnographic practice, as some of you know, alma mater, Jagiellonian University. And he has in recent years moved into using his sociology background into training in his artwork. His current work examines themes such as imperial nostalgia, Polish identity, and the location of Africa in the Eastern European imagination. So there are 4 pieces that I'm going to focus on today. One of them is Janeka Was Here from 2010. I'll show the images when I start talking about them. A guided tour of Fort Amsterdam, also from 2010. Polish Cultural Season on Madagascar, which also has another name, which we'll get to. It has like 5 of them, which is from 2006. And then Ashes and Diamonds, which is also known as Nollywood Ashes and Diamonds, from 2014. So that's his latest one. And so Janeka was here, and Ashes and Diamonds are the 2 that are at Kim currently. And all deal with Africa and Africans as subjects and or others. And Simon attempts to play with the discourse of the imperial past, all the while calling upon ethnographic inquiry and sociological and anthropological methods, or at least literature. Another piece from 2009, which I don't have the image here, but it's also Googleable, plays with and mocks concepts from Levi-Strauss's Tristes Tropiques. So the impetus behind this presentation is to provide further insight into how an artist like Janeka Simona utilizes both ethnographic and artistic authority in his work. While one may question the anthropological, especially cultural anthropological value in this investigation, I would argue that it is important, in this case it's really important, it is important for cultural anthropologists to think outside of the confines of ethnography equals anthropology, or ethnographic research plus participant observation equals cultural anthropology, and instead delve into how our particular training can be applied to an analysis of contemporary art, artists, and exhibitions. Especially those that claim to utilize the very same methodology as cultural anthropologists. So as Fiona Siegenthaler states in her 2013 article, and she's an anthropologist in South Africa, I think, somewhere, states in her article, Towards an Ethnographic Turn in Contemporary Art Scholarship, that, quote, the actual quality of field research, so proximity and direct experience, that cannot be objectified but only experienced subjectively in an embodied manner, has become an essential aspect not only of social anthropology but also of contemporary art practices. Other anthropologists, and some aren't anthropologists, I should say, Briard, Clifford, Foster, Meyer, Rutten, Van Dieren, and Sotart have all made similar arguments in one form or another. These contributions to understanding the link or contributions between ethnography and contemporary art, especially within critical practice, have been of great assistance during the writing and preparation of this presentation. So I've read all of them and more. So there's 2 questions that form the structure, although not always directly, of my inquiry. So the first is, how can ethnographic critique be used as art critique? And this points to the importance of a deeper analysis of the role of the, what I'm going to call the phenotypically white European researcher artist in their work. And I use the term phenotypically white because my past research was on identity, and one of the things that I happen to know, particularly, I would say, in this part of Europe, is that the moniker and the identity of white has not yet been formulated, and it's important to, for me in particular, you all know, but for me to at least make it clear that when I'm talking about white, I'm not talking about white as identity. I'm talking about the phenotypical sort of whatever the identifying skin color, peach, natural, cream, whatever you want to call it is, because that's what other people see. So again, so the phenotypically white European researcher artist in their work. So ethnography, a research practice that combines interviews, observation, and participant observation over a long period of time, was once described by anthropologists and also one of the founders of performance studies, Dwight Conquergood, in his text, Rethinking Ethnography Towards a Critical Cultural Politics, as a practice that, quote, requires getting one's body immersed in the field for a period of time sufficient to enable one to participate inside that culture. Ethnography is an embodied practice. It is an intensely sensuous way of knowing, unquote. So And then if you start thinking about ethnographic critique itself is a direct result of the inward turn of anthropology, an embodied inward turn, and as a result, ethnographic writing. So anthropology and anthropologists had in the past a close relationship with colonial and Soviet projects, and therefore have been criticized for taking part, or at least contributing to, oppressive tactics against the indigenous and ethnic minority groups which they studied. There have also been more recent criticisms of cultural anthropology in terms of how anthropologists frame the other in their research. Therefore, intersubjectivity has become an important factor in ethnographic writing. I would love to find out what that is in Latvian, by the way, intersubjectivity. What is it? Did you translate intersubjectivity?
No.
Okay. I just want to know. Anyways, so therefore intersubjectivity has become an important factor in ethnographic writing. So who are we? What are we doing here? And how does our own identity and or background impact the way that we see the world and our ethnographic work? The second question asks, what is the role of the Black African other in ethnographic accounts and art exhibitions? And so I aim to answer this question through an analysis of Simon's Ashes and Diamonds. You'll also see the image from that in a second, which is a short documentary project wherein which Simon engages with members of Nigeria's Nollywood film industry. In this film, Simon plays a prominent role and brings up the question of ethnographic and artistic authority. And in the words of anthropologist James Clifford, who famously wrote a long article on the subject of ethnographic authority, that, quote, "It is more than ever crucial for different peoples to form complex, concrete images of one another, as well as of the relationships of knowledge and power that connect them. But no sovereign scientific method or ethical stance can guarantee the truth of such images. They are constituted. The critique of colonial modes of representation has shown at least this much in specific historical relations and dialogue." So it's critical to examine how Janeka Simona, as an artist, takes up Clifford's call to form complex images of others, especially through the prisms of knowledge and power. So I'm not going to talk about Foucault, but that's a Foucault thing. Historical relations and dialogue. And I would argue that Simon does not necessarily go deep enough past his initial attempts at contextualizing imperial nostalgia, the colonial imagination, and otherness to truly engage in a deep discussion or critique of how his images not only employ power relations, so power relations between the artist and their subject, the colonized and the colonizer, and so on, but also in what ways they are constituted. While the, quote, "specific historical relations and dialogue of which Clifford speaks are on the surface a part of Simon's work, his play on imperial nostalgia and the nature of imperialism could do much, much more work on this subject." And you'll see what I do with this. So imperialism and the dreams of an imperialism that could have been are central themes to three of Janek's works. So A Polish Year on Madagascar, which is also known as a Polish cultural season on Madagascar. I think? No? There it goes. Okay. So here it is. Janek was here, which is this one, which is one of the ones at Kim. And a guided tour of Fort Amsterdam from 2010, which I do not have the image, but I do have a great description of it coming up. Oops, that's not what I want to do. Okay. So with A Polish Year on Madagascar, Simon attempted to provide a commentary of Poland's dreams of having a colony in the island nation of Madagascar, which is one of the countries of Africa, and also known because of the film, the cartoon. Those of you with so if any of you know anything about Polish history or World War II, and you can make a connection between Poland and Madagascar. One of the things that you'll know is that the context around this colony that never was in Madagascar was a bit more complicated in the United States colony of freed slaves in Liberia sense of the word. So quickly, so in 1937, hi, this was one of the curators is here, hi. So in 1937, Poland wanted a place to send parts of its expanding population, including its Jewish citizens, because there was great famine and they needed, a lot of food. They dropped that plan at the start of World War II, and then in 1938, Adolf Eichmann, the architect, Nazi architect behind the final solution, devised a plan with the help of France and Poland to solve the quote-unquote Jewish question by hoping to send all of Europe's Jews to Madagascar. This was known as the Madagascar Plan. So this is a little bit more complicated than just wanting a colony, a lot more complicated, which colonization is a lot more complicated on the surface anyways, than it is on the surface anyways. So, and I only just found this out. So anyway, so more complicated than it seems. So this particular historical fact that I know of does not play into Simon's piece as much as he is strictly focusing upon the idea of colonization, which I'll get to a bit later. In one of the writings about the project for the web portal culture.poland, which has a biography of Janeka Simona, states that, quote, the cultural expansion organized by Simon provided an ironic commentary to the contemporary aspirations of Polish society to place itself within the world elite. And I'll actually return to the idea of Poland wanting to, quote, place itself within the world elite, because this is kind of important in a moment. But I first want to delve further into how Simon attempts to deal with or comment upon the subject of cultural expansion in some of his other works. And again, as I said, this is a work in progress, so there's a lot more works that he has that I would love to kind of get my hands on. So this type of commentary, although not specifically on Poland's own aspirations, is also evident in his pieces A Guided Tour of Fort Amsterdam and Janeka was here. And just briefly, for the Polish cultural season on Madagascar, that's the image from the poster art, and then that's an installation view from when he did an installation at BWA Warsaw. So again, unfortunately, I don't have a guided tour here. So a guided tour is a video that is situated at Fort Amsterdam in Ghana. Fort Amsterdam happens to have been a trading post, a slave trading post, complete with holding cells. And in his review of this work, which was part of Simon's personal exhibition, Morze, the Sea, at Raster in Warsaw in 2010, Daniel Miller wrote for Art in America that, quote, the show's purest and most enigmatic work is a guided tour of Fort Amsterdam, a video of the artist hiring a rickshaw to ride around a European fort in Ghana. The trip looks uncomfortable, both physically and morally, yet the artist seems at peace and serene. Because I myself haven't seen the work, I can't necessarily comment on whether or not this is an accurate description. I only know from what I have read. But the work itself, although labeled as a commentary on tourism, is one that has the potential to play with the artist's own positionality as a white European. And the image of a white male being drawn around a slave fort on a rickshaw by a black African driver, I was trying to figure out what that word would be, recalls sort of colonial masters being catered to by their subjects, or at least the race and ethnic-based stratification that still occurs in many parts of the world. This may or may not be the artist's direct intent. At least in one interview that I could find, one of the things that he does talk about is he talks about sort of a play on tourism and the way that sort of tourists, when they go to these specific sites, the type of roles that they happen to play. So being drawn around by rickshaws or you know, listening to a tour guide who may or may not know anything about what's going on about the historical site and so on. And again, this provokes one of the questions raised earlier in this presentation. So how does our own identity or background impact the way that we see the world and our ethnographic work? And then going to Janeka was here, which, no, that's not it. I don't usually use PowerPoint. So Janeka was here, which is at Kim currently, and as I said, one of the curators is here, so I just got really nervous when I saw her. Right, no, it's okay. So anyway, so Janeka was here, which is a map of poultry producers in Ghana. So this is a map of Ghana with the words Janeka was here written on top of it in a childlike scribble. It looks kind of like my handwriting, actually. So the piece is meant to be a type of colonial tagging or just tagging in general. I've seen it described as sort of referring to the types of tagging that tourists sometimes leave on historical monuments. If you've ever been to the pyramids in Egypt, you'll see a lot of that, actually. But I kind of see it as one thing, which is colonial tagging in terms of colonial governments leave their handwriting on their occupied or colonized spaces even after independence has been declared and the last of the colonial or occupying authorities' offices have been shuttered, as Latvia knows all too well. And it may not necessarily be that Janeka Simona is going in a specific direction, but it would be interesting to play with. I should say that the one critique that I found of this piece, which is the Miller piece, he's highly critical of it, and he actually says that Simon's approach could almost be bracketed as anti-imperialist critique. His work seems too naive, even childlike for the designation. And actually, I found an early interview with Simon when he was just starting out, where he sort of talks about how he kind of started out just playing with things kind of like a child, and then he realized he wanted to be more serious. So Janeka Simona is the same age as me, so I kind of understand where he was in 2002 versus where he is now. So he may still have sort of that childlike quality, but there is probably some deeper thinking back there. And the work itself, like a guided tour, also engages in a form of imperialist nostalgia. So just quickly, the anthropologist Renato Rosaldo claims that imperialist nostalgia is this, that it revolves around a paradox. A person kills somebody and then mourns his or her victim. In a more attenuated form, someone deliberately alters a form of life and then regrets that things have not remained as they were prior to his or her intervention. Imperialist nostalgia uses a pose of innocent yearning both to capture people's imaginations and to conceal its complicity with often brutal domination. So Rosaldo is not just talking about former colonial or occupying authorities. He's also speaking about anthropologists. He even uses his wife as an example. So this sort of thing that people do, that some anthropologists do, where they say, I wish that I could have studied these people before the outside got to them, or before they got completely engulfed by modernity. I actually quoted there is a documentary film director who said that about her subjects recently. So those are kind of examples of imperialist nostalgia. And in the case of the experiences to which Simon is attempting to remark upon, it's actually more about not so much an imperialist past it was, but more about an imagined imperial past. So imperial imagination and nostalgia for something that could have been, possibly without destroying the place or people that you were to colonize or to deport. Imperial imagination tries to see the lighter side of colonization and occupation. It is also about, as I stated before, the wish to play, I would say, with the big kids or to sit at the adult table. So again, to kind of be on the broader world stage. So, as well as to reach back to a time of innocence before your own country was an imperial or occupied subject. It is also about longing for a time, imagined or real, innocence was lost. But Simon, as a quote-unquote white European, also has to problematize his own positionality, specifically the type of images that are invoked when he sits on a rickshaw being drawn around a former slave trading post, as well as the role that his own whiteness may or may not play in his examinations of imperialism and the colonial past. Although Poland did not succeed in having its own colony in Africa, my people thank them, and although there is a valid argument that Poland is itself a former occupied territory with the marks of colonial encounters still present, this does not mean that Simon can escape the same types of critiques that have been launched upon other European, and I would say white males, wherever they are, American, European, Canadian, artists and anthropologists who have attempted similar projects. The same type of intersubjectivity that rose out of critiques of ethnographic authority and ethnographic technique is an intersubjectivity that is needed in Simon's work. I don't know what happened with that. So if a Polish year on Madagascar, a tour of Fort Amsterdam, and Janeka was here, embraced a colonial and imagined a real imperial past, then Ashes and Diamonds, please tell me I'm getting there, yes. So then Ashes and Diamonds from 2014, so this is the poster art from it, and we'll get to why it's like this, leans towards the ethnographic and who has the power of knowledge production. It is also, in my view, an example of an ongoing problem in contemporary art, one that's been discussed by people who are a lot more experienced in this than I am, in terms of the role of the Black African or really any other sort of non-white other in artwork that aims to provide an account of their world, of quote-unquote their world, I should say. So Ashes and Diamonds, if you have not had the chance to see it at Kim, which you should, I saw it 3 times, is a short film in which Janeka Simon travels to Nigeria to propose an adaptation of Andre Wada's famous 1958 film, Ashes and Diamonds, to a number of Nollywood producers, directors, and distributors. The appeal of Nollywood to Simon is not just that it is based in a country that on the surface is culturally different than his native Poland, but that it is also the second largest, after India's Bollywood, film industry in the world. So the only stat I have is from 2010, but approximately 2,500 films per year are put out by Nollywood. It's a large production. And it's also a film industry that has not just caught the attention of Nigerians, but also the entire African continent, and has become well known internationally. There was even quite recently, I think last month I saw this on the BBC, that there was a Nollywood film premiere in London that had kind of like the whole red carpet and everything. So it's becoming not just sort of locally in terms of in the Nigerian sense of becoming sort of like culturally important. It's becoming globally culturally important in the same way that Bollywood has become globally culturally important, both within and outside, I would say, of the Nigerian and African diaspora. So the film itself is both a documentary and I'd actually argue an ethnography of Nollywood. And in the film's opening sequence, I have to remember this, so Simon is walking through a market in a loose-fitting casual suit with a t-shirt, and I love the internet. With market workers framing him in the background, as well as posters from Nollywood films. And the thing about Nollywood is that, as one of the people that he talks to in the film says, it's not about quality, it's about quantity. So some of the films are not necessarily what some people would regard as, say, like art house classics. Some are, but it's a huge, again, very high production on DVDs and VHS tapes and so on, being sold in markets, and very quick production to distribution turnaround time as well. And so this opening image or scene, at least for me, as a American is that it's reminiscent of these sort of Save the Children or Oxfam commercials that I saw on television growing up in the United States. So a celebrity, usually it's a white celebrity, but it could be anyone. Ben Vereen, who is definitely not white, has even done this as well, is walking through a neighborhood in some unnamed African country. They always say, like, I'm in some place. And they then kind of stop with the camera on them, and they look straight at the camera and they say, it only takes $1 a day to save a child's life. And then they ask you to donate. And so these types of images have become so iconic that they've been parodied most recently by Saturday Night Live, which you can also find on the internet. I was going to show it, and then I realized it wasn't going to work in this presentation. So anyways, at least for me, when I saw this image, that's where my mind went immediately, was to these sort of commercials. And I can almost like imagine Janeka Simona walking up and asking somebody, saying to somebody, it only takes $1 a day to produce my film. So then the film then cuts to an interview with a Nollywood street distributor who also kind of narrates the beginning of the film. Who retells the story of Nollywood and the growth of Nigeria's film industry. And Janeka Simona is then seen interviewing and approaching Nollywood producers and directors such as Niji Akani, who's an off-Nollywood director, and Fidelis Duker, who's a producer. And at first, he lets his subjects narrate, providing a background on Nollywood for the viewer, particularly how it reversed the flow of Nigerian audiences from Western films to Nigerian directed, produced, and distributed films. And then Simona speaks and mentions why he is in Nigeria. He wants to adapt Wada's 1958 film about the Polish resistance after the end of World War II, or specifically about how Polish society was divided after the end of the war, to the Nigerian context, specifically the Biafran War, which is also known as the Nigerian Civil War of 1967 to 1970. So he says, you know Andrzej Wada? And they tell him no, and some of them shake their heads. And then he replies, it is the most famous Polish film director. The producers and directors and even distributors seem intrigued, but are taken aback when he mentions the Biafran War, which is still a delicate subject in Nigeria. And so Akani says that it could be done, but it would have to be from his perspective, the Igbo perspective. He makes that very clear. And just as, I mean, God, do I have time to explain this? So one of the reasons why this is important in terms of how they react to this is that one thing that they say to him is, you know, it's still a sensitive subject. The censors might not like it. When this kind of thing has been brought up before, it's been smashed down by the censors. And most recently, in 2014, there was a Nigerian film called Half a Yellow Sun, whose release was delayed in Nigeria by the film censors because of its delicate subject matter. And the reason why it's also important that we have Akani say that this should be done from the Igbo perspective is because, just briefly, so during the 1960s, 30,000 Igbo were killed by the Hausas and more than 1 million became refugees. And then on the 30th of May, Colonel Emeka Uwaku, who was Igbo, declared an independent republic of Biafra, which is in the southern part of Nigeria and is mostly Igbo. And then 2.5 years later, 1 million people were dead from famine and fighting. Nobel Prize-winning author Chinua Achebe has actually also wrote a book on the subject called There Was a Country, A Personal History of Biafra. So this is sort of a touchy subject, as you can sort of imagine. And they're not saying that, they're not telling Simona it can't be done, but they're sort of saying that it might take a while for it to happen. It might not necessarily happen on his, sort of his timeline. It might happen in 4 years or so. And I don't necessarily want to comment on the use of the Biafran War by Simona in his project, because as you can already tell, it's a little bit more complicated a subject than what Simona presents it as, much like Poland and Madagascar. And that also has to do for time. And But what I do want to focus on is the problem of what I would call like ethnographic or autoethnographic authority in Simon's work. So again, he fails to go below the surface, and it might be because he's leaving it up to the audience to do so. Because this piece itself, at least for me, could be much more about more than an attempt at adaptation. So like a tour of Fort Amsterdam, it could be an examination of representation or an exploration of Simon's own, say, whiteness and Europeanness or whatever, in the post-colonial context, among other things. Or it could also be, as I'll get to in a bit, his artistic and ethnographic authority. And there are questions that Simon could ask himself, ones that are raised by Rutten et al. In the article Revisiting the Ethnographic Turn in Contemporary Art. So is this artist constructing outsiderness detracted from a politics of here and now? Does this artist locate the site of artistic transformation elsewhere in the field of the other, with the cultural other, the oppressed post-colonial, subaltern, or subcultural? Is this work a pseudo-ethnographic report, a disguised travelogue from the world art market? And finally, is this artist othering the self or selving the other? And in Simon's case, I would actually say yes to all of these questions. He doesn't always answer them within the context of his work. And again, to be fair, I've only seen very few interviews with him, and then one on Ashes and Diamonds, but it was in Polish, and it was a video. And I don't have a computer at home and the technology to figure it out. And then the readable ones that I have seen have not specifically been on these projects, and one was done by somebody who was very horrible at interviewing. There is also the question of how much prior research he puts into his projects before he goes into them. Sometimes he does quite a bit, sometimes he doesn't do a ton. So how much does he know about the Biafran War, a war in which actually Soviet funding played a part? So the Soviet Union gave money to the Nigerian side. How much does he know about the ethnic backgrounds of his subjects and how that might factor into how they view the Biafran or AKA the Nigerian Civil War? How much does he know about censorship in Nollywood? And if he does know more, he doesn't necessarily make it clear. The other question that Rutten et al. Ask, following the lead of Lucy Lepard, is, quote, is this artist wanted there and by whom? Every artist and anthropologist should be required to answer this question in depth before launching what threatens to be intrusive or invasive projects, often called interventions. And so I wonder, is Janeka Simon ready to ask himself this question going into his next project, which he already has? And then what about the mostly, I would say, mostly African subjects of his most recent work? So the other as he presents them. They are given some agency in Ashes and Diamonds, as this project sinks or floats on their word. So if this actually comes to fruition, it's all about them. They have to collaborate on it for it to happen. He can't really do it on his own. But how much are they partners or collaborators in his work? You know, and it's not that this type of work hasn't been done before, because the world does not operate within a vacuum. So there are, you know, artists who are from subaltern, colonial, et cetera, backgrounds who have employed similar methods or explore common themes in their work. So you have things, oh wow, okay, there went my notes. So you have people like Fred Wilson and Yinka Shonibari and Kara Walker and Aisha Cousins, among others, who also, who in some ways provoke a more constructive dialogue on the colonial past. So that'd be Walker and Wilson. And then African pop culture and the post-imperial condition and aesthetics. That would be Shonibari and Cousins. And I do say that, you know, these are artists which he might want to pay attention to if he's further interested in participating in this dialogue of Africanness, imperial nostalgia, and colonial encounters. I would even say perhaps collaborating with, because he has shown interest in collaboration in the past, and he does do a lot of collaborative projects. So this question of dialogue with participants and subjects, as well as with other artists, also raises a larger question. one which has haunted both anthropology and art for many, many years. So who has the right to speak and for whom? This is a question about the authoritative voice, not unlike the one that Clifford speaks of in his work on ethnographic authority. So anthropologist Susan Gall famously wrote in Between Speech and Language that, quote, verbal interaction concerns who can speak about what. Further, Gall adds that power, quote, is more than an authoritative voice in decision-making. Its strongest form may be well in the ability to define social reality, to impose visions of the world. And while Gall is specifically pointing to the power, or lack thereof, given to women's voices and experiences, a point that has been expanded upon Gayatri Spivak to include subaltern women's voices. This type of argument extends to the subjects and participants in Simon's work. And while one can argue that Ashes and Diamonds, again, as I said, gives them, the Nigerian subjects, some power of narration, there is no doubt that this is Simon's project, and these voices as collaborators or contributors are missing from this and some of his other work, although it's not missing from the poster. It's very clear from the poster, and it's very clear from the credits of the film as well. So this also kind of brings up a question of, who gets credit in exhibitions as in also in all other written work. And this is a question in ethnography as well. So the producers and so on are giving credit in the poster art, but so far not on the exhibition label or title. Although to be fair, Kim does not have exhibition labels or titles. So it wouldn't be there anyways. Nor are they listed as collaborators in the exhibition catalog or in Simon's bio or a CV, something which Simon should have some power over at this point. And again, this is also a problem that plagues anthropology because there's always a question about whether or not the people that you interview for your ethnographic work, whether or not you should also give them credit as collaborators in your research. And some anthropologists do. I have plenty of friends who do that in their work, who actually talk about their informants as collaborators and give them credit, even if they're kind of not using their real names, but give them credit in their work. Because through their interviews and through participation, they have contributed to the knowledge that they that is being produced. But this is not common at all. It's pretty rare. I just went really quickly. And while I'm not denying Janeka Simon's right to be able to pursue his current interests or to continue to create projects in or on the post-colonial or subaltern or global South, some of which one of the most recent ones was actually supported through the Polish Institute. One of them was called Janeka Was Not Here. So instead of Janeka Was Here, it was Janeka Was Not Here from 2014, which was at the Clark House Initiative in New Delhi, India. I do believe that it is important to be able to ruminate upon and question his artistic and ethnographic authority, specifically the ways in which his current work output deals with what performance studies scholar Tavia Nyong'o calls the performance of history. And although it may be difficult to base a critique strictly upon what is hung upon the walls or floors of an exhibition space without yourself participating in the research, travel, and other acts involved in its creation, as Seigenthaler once stated when she said that, can artwork based on extensive research, travel, and social involvement be judged on the basis of its presentation in an exhibition space? Because if we weren't there when the actual creative act was happening, can we actually fully judge what we're seeing in front of us? It's the same can be said for saying that it can be just as difficult to judge an anthropologist's ethnographic work without having been a part of the writing and research process, or as Gertz once famously stated, without being there. And it's also our role as the audience, academics and viewers, to be able to freely question the work and the positionality and authority of its creator that we see before us. So that's actually my conclusion. I went a lot faster than I was going to. So I'd love to open up for questions if anybody has any.
I have one.
Good, thank you.
Do you know, perhaps, what is the perception, overall perception in the audience when they see this artwork? Do they have this background critique in their minds already that this is some kind of entrainment already? Or do they have this critique in themselves, or people rarely do it?
That's a good question. And thankfully, we have Maya, who's here, who is one of the curators of the Society Acts exhibition. So I don't know, because I know what I had in my head, and I can speak to that. I can't really speak to what the general audience has in their mind when they're going in. I mean, I do have a background in museum anthropology, and one of the things that we're always sort of taught is that you can never really know what to expect with the audience. You can kind of only provide the information that's needed and ask questions, and then allow the space for them to ask questions about the work, because you never know where people are coming from. You never know like what their background is, if they're artists, if they're people who might know Janeka, if they know this artist, if they have if they have like an academic or any other kind of education in the work itself. I mean, it could be that somebody's coming and knows a lot about Nigerian film and knows about Nollywood. I mean, it could be. I mean, there's a lot of Nigerian students here in Riga, actually, and if any one of them came to Kim and saw this, they might have a very different perception of it than, say, someone, a Latvian who doesn't know about Nollywood, or even an American like me who kind of barely knows about it. I only TA'd one class on it.
Yeah, maybe I can add something.
Yeah, but Maya, thank you.
You are totally right, and it's always actually a responsibility of the institution, and of course of the curators. And in these cases, I collaborated with Kim on this exhibition. And I mean, I expect also in the institution to put some effort to bring a different audience. And actually, I think the ideal scenario would be that that the institution brings really different audiences, both like students and maybe adults or children, and for every audience the way how your project exhibition would be different, because that's the educational part of the exhibition. And of course, like if you're an art professional, you already see like what kind of questions the artwork brings, which is the case here. I really appreciate this, because
thank you. I was so afraid.
No, really, because I think this is one of the I think none of the other works in the exhibition address these questions, and that's why we choose also Janeka, because we thought it's very that he is quite controversial and ambiguous himself in his work, and that it can bring out like these kind of issues of post-colonial and other kind of similar questions, which I find myself very important, especially here in Riga. Like in Sweden, where we exhibited it first time, of course it's also very topical, because they have like different groups of immigrants, and I mean it's everywhere. It's like really topical thing in contemporary art. So, but the way how you actually, I'll say, there were like lots of actually questions, like addressed by you, because you don't know how can you actually, how the artwork enters this space of ethnography and anthropology and so on, because I think in this case actually it enters the question, but it doesn't enter the space where it should be. So that's my point of view actually about these works.
Yeah. And I think that's actually, I mean, I feel that it's, because the first time I saw it was, I went like on a Saturday just for the curator's tour. And it was the first time I saw the work, and I didn't have time necessarily to sit with it. So it was actually at that moment that I decided I was going to do my talk on it, because of the fact that for me, it wasn't, I mean, it was young. I mean, I have like a whole other critique about the Fuller exhibit, but that, you know, for me, it was really like seeing Janeka Simon's work and thinking, okay, like I don't, particularly here, I haven't seen, with the exception of the Valdemārs Matvejs exhibit that was at Riga Borza Muzees, there hasn't been a lot of like visualization, I think, of like the African, or of, I would say, Black African bodies here, particularly in artwork in Latvia. And there actually hasn't been a lot of like African artists visiting either, which is another whole other critique. That was my critique of Riga 2014. But so for me, I was really kind of drawn to it, because I was like, well, here it is, and it's in this space. And I know just from, you know, my past research, which was on individuals of Black African descent in Latvia, that there is sort of, you know, particularly if I'm going to be looking at this in Kim, where there aren't labels. I mean, they hand you the piece of paper that has information on the artwork, and that's about it. And then it's like really about open to interpretation and what you bring in. So, you know, to be in a place where there is not a lot of like context about Africa, or at least Africanness, or the place of Black Africans in terms of greater artwork, and then to kind of go into the space and see these two pieces where, you know, it's very prominent. Ciao. So where it's very prominent, you know, not these faces, for me, I think I was really drawn to, okay, like, A, how is this going to come across to the audience? And then B, I started thinking about how it was coming across to me. And one part, it was one piece, and the first time I actually sat down and watched the film, the first time I was kind of angry. And then the second time, which was 2 seconds after the film ended, and I watched it again, I was like, okay, I see what's going on here. And then the third time was when more of the questions started being raised about, particularly about this idea of collaboration, but then more importantly about this idea of authority. Because as an anthropologist, you know, and also as an educator, I have to say, I always have to face this question of authority. And so for me, I thought it was really important to kind of look at how he is dealing with this idea of authority in his work, if he is at all. And even him, like, you know, in some of the interviews that I did see with him, there's like 2 that I could find. You know, for a person who has like dealt a lot with like technology and video games and internet and all that kind of stuff, he has like a very limited web presence. Like no blog, nothing like that. Versus like Corey Archangel, who, you know, did similar kind of technology type based work, who is like all about like, you know, using his Twitter feed to create books and everything. So in terms of ones that I saw, again, you know, he veers between like, I'm doing this because I think it's going to be really fun, and I'm kind of a prankster, which is one of the other part of the background behind the Madagascar project, is that he was like, he wanted to make fun of all these Polish cultural years that happen in all of these different cities, like in London and so on. And he was just like, well, why don't we just do one in Madagascar? So he goes like from, I want to be a prankster and be funny, to sort of like, I want to talk about these serious issues. So he kind of goes back and forth between those two. And in some cases, and I think at least in the film, the Ashes and Diamonds film, there is sometimes those two kind of come together, because I think there's like that humor and kind of pranking in the beginning when he's walking through, because he has that like little smile on his face, kind of snide, and you know, he's obviously playing with some sort of imagery. And then it has like the serious piece where he's like, I really want to do this film. How can I do this film? Will you let me do this film? Yeah, hope that helped. Dang, I'm so happy you're here.
You described it very well. It's perfect.
I'm spending 2 weeks on it.
And of course, his personality is like everywhere present. You can feel it. And
yeah,
I guess it would work better if it wasn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because it annoys me as well, actually. Like myself, maybe because of that we also choose it, because you know, like, you see all these problems that basically contemporary art is facing at the moment
Mm-hmm.
itself, you know, and also like how the work communicates and actually how institution communicates the work is all these questions also pop up there,
Mm-hmm.
which is I mean it's really a pity that there are no people from contemporary art.
They were supposed to be here.
No, like, we can discuss it more, but I think it's also, I mean, you brought up also questions about contemporary art stuff. I mean, how this appropriation, adaptation, you know, all this kind of new kind of ways of dealing with something, you know, in the way how we actually can work with these. I don't know, it's very ambiguous.
Yeah, and there's also, and then it does also come back to that question of authority again, because of the fact that there seems to, I think there's, you know, from my time in the art world and also from when I was working at Studio Museum in Harlem, which is an African-American contemporary art space. I mean, that's what it's founded upon, where they're trying to do the opposite and sort of talking about, okay, like we have the power now to tell our story. There is always this issue of, I think, kind of, well, when say African artists or African American artists are doing work on quote unquote African subjects or quote unquote African American subjects, they're told that they're not being like bold enough, or that they're sort of like not being introspective, or maybe they're just doing ethnically specific work is usually the term that's used. Whereas generally, not all the time, but when a artist who's not from that community does work on a similar subject, it's considered like they're taking this really interesting take on Africanness, or they're on traditional Bantu design work and how they're exhibiting it and so on, and nobody sort of, you know, the authority piece is not questioned as much. But that's also, again, a parallel issue in anthropology. And so for somebody like me who straddles both worlds, it's becoming a little bit more clear. Other questions? 99.9% of you are my students, so I know you're good question askers. Even somebody I don't know. How many of you were able to see the exhibit before you came to this talk?
Now all of you should go.
Right, now all of you should go. Right, it's free on Tuesdays, I can tell you that. They're open until 8 p.m. on Tuesdays, if you're worried about that. And it is actually, the exhibit's up until mid-April, so you have plenty of time to go and see it. And
there will be some extra tours announced probably.
Yeah.
I will do something myself, so.
Yeah, I mean, to see it in the context of to sort of see this work in the context of the exhibit is one thing, and then, at least for me, when I had to start isolating his work, it was a completely different experience altogether. And he's actually, one of his more recent pieces, he's looked at the Museum of Man in Paris, and he looked at these particular sculptural objects that are there, particularly ones that are, because the Museum of Man in Paris is an ethnographic museum, so kind of taking objects from other countries and displaying them so that we can kind of know what it's, you know, artifacts and art from different countries. And so he went, I think, most likely into the African room, and he took these specific sculptures from this one collection, and he decided that he was going to recreate them using 3D printing. So he has these 3D printed versions of these African sculptures, very small. They sit on pedestals. One of them looks like a dildo, but very small kind of sculptures that are sitting there. So again, he's still really delving into this theme of, I think he's still kind of going into, or drawing from, I think, his sociological background and this kind of like ethnographic piece too.
Yes, I don't know if you mentioned it earlier, but is this Nigerian-based work, has it only been presented in like Europe and like only in Latvia or as mother?
He's had it in some other places too, because it was in obviously in Sweden.
It's work in progress, and it's like he showed. I mean, no, actually that was the first time we showed the piece. Actually, we exhibited. It was in Malmo last year. So now I don't know. Maybe he has shown it somewhere else, but I haven't been informed.
Yeah, I think he did it in Poland. He might have done it at his home gallery.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, because I think he might have done it at Raster or one of the other places where exhibits.
But it is still like just like an introduction to this work that he's creating, and I don't know, because he's super ambitious. He always started, but like. I mean, not always they are realized, like, or finished or something. So I doubt that this actually gonna be finished. But you never know. But it's like, because it already has become an artwork itself. What he done like so far, but actually only with this idea. And basically, it would be nice to see some kind of production or like that film that he is aiming to do. But I don't know. It's actually very complicated. I think it's not so easy. But he wants to do there or something. It's like, I don't know. Yeah, it's very naive as well. Yeah. I think.
Oh yeah. And also too, there's a lot of other issues with doing work in Nigeria as well. I think it sits just as high on the World Corruption Index as Latvia does. I don't know, I think it's a little bit higher on the corruption index actually. So there's some issues with that too, and kind of the producing and the financing, and then the censorship issue. And you're right that he also kind of does a lot of projects. I mean, I was like in my head, I was thinking, like when I was coming here, I was thinking, okay, the word that's usually used when we talk about artists and writers and so on, is we always talk about them being prolific, like they're just producing a lot of work all the time.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there's no other way how you can live in contemporary art.
Yeah, he has to, and he has funding, but it's like that's the only way you can also get funding is in order to produce work at the rate that he's doing it. And so, everything's happening at parallel, and he's still kind of doing his computer-based stuff while doing these explorations of, post-coloniality and tourism and whatever else. But he kind of goes back and forth between the two, but he's definitely, like, I would say, I wouldn't necessarily like prolific, but like workaholic as well, but just always working. And trying to get things done. So yeah, it will be interesting to see if this does occur in a few years. Thank you.